Brilliant. So I'd like to start off by welcoming anybody watching this Q&A on the link between biodiversity and rainfall between Walter Jehne and Wendy Bradshaw, who will be introduced shortly. We started this conversation at a field day Gillamii and RegenWA held at local farmers Pete and Wendy Bradshaw's property, and realised that this important conversation needed to be continued, which has led us to today. I would like to thank Walter, Regenerate Earth and Wendy Bradshaw for being so generous with their knowledge and time, the Australian Government National Landcare Program and Future Drought Fund, RegenWA and the Gillamii Centre for their contribution. Gillamii is a not-for-profit community group that strives to lead, inspire and support productive agriculture, rural communities and healthy natural ecosystems. We operate in the South Coast region of WA that is enriched by an incredible natural landscape, including the mountain peaks of the Stirling Range National Park, unique wetlands and waterways, tall forests in the west and coastlines to the south. Our agricultural lands are prosperous but are not without their issues, including but not limited to salinity and non-wetting soils. We recognise the importance of our duty to protect the country as our First Nations Manning, Canning and Goring people did and still do. So why is this conversation important for Gillamii? Of the 18 million hectares of Western Australia's native vegetation already cleared, most is in the state's southwest, coinciding with our most biodiverse ecosystems. Direct clearing is not the only activity affecting our state's native vegetation. It also faces ongoing degradation through fragmentation and loss of connectivity, overgrazing, weed invasion, altered hydrology, salinity, dieback diseases, feral animals, altered fire regimes, and climate change. Combine this with the fact that rainfall has declined by up to 20% in WA's southwest, with a westward shift in rainfall zones by up to 100 kilometres in some areas of WA's grain belt. Working with our landholder network towards sustainable land management is imperative to reduce further degradation and the future of our rural communities. And with that, I'm just going to hand over to Bonnie Jupp from RegenWA.
Thanks, Ash. So I'm Bonnie Jupp and I'm the project officer at RegenWA. And firstly, I would like to also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we are zooming in from today and pay our respects to the cultural elders of the past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. Today, I sit here on Whadjuk land, where it is the Noongar season of Camberang, the flowering. So during this time, the landscape is carpeted with a rainbow of wildflowers. The bulgur grass tree starts to bloom and reptiles are out of hibernation, making for good food for bush tucker. So a little bit about RegenWA. It's a project that is run through Perth NRM, which stands for Natural Resource Management. The program is focused on supporting farmers who are investigating alternative production practices that aim to reduce or reverse the impact of productivity constraints, whilst also acknowledging and learning from the sustainable land management carried out over thousands of years by the traditional owners of this land. We bring together and share the latest regenerative ideas and projects happening around Western Australia with the intention of broadening the uptake of sustainable land management practices and creating a future that we're proud to pass on to the next generation. We work collaboratively with a wide range of local grower groups and organisations to share projects, events and information as far as possible. When the knowledge gets shared, we can all continue to learn together. So RegenWA has a newsletter, social media and website which has lots of useful resources on it. And we also run events such as field days and webinars. And our RegenWA Farmers Network, where people can sign up to receive the newsletter and regular updates, has around 1,200 members. I'll now give some background on Wendy Bradshaw and Walter Jehne before we begin the Q&A. And so I'll start with Wendy. Wendy Bradshaw is a passionate environmentalist who strives to learn more about how we can all farm better with nature. Her family farm, Murray Wells, is where she can implement these learnings from her studies, including a Bachelor of Land Management and a Master's in Education. She has worked at Greening Australia for a decade, as well as working with South Coast NRM for 4 years. Wendy is a highly respected member of the Gillamii Committee and uses her own environmental consultancy business to focus on restoring biodiversity and soil health on farms. And Wendy sees our biggest and vital challenge is to understanding and profitably implementing the transition from conventional to biological agriculture. Now, Walter Jehne is an internationally recognised soil microbiologist and innovation strategist. He has immense field and research and experience in soils, grasslands, agriculture, and forests at local, national, and international levels. Walter's specialisation is the role of soil microbes' symbiotic processes in the ecology of diseases, plant health, nutrient and waste recycling, soil pathogenesis, and the regeneration of biosystems. Decades of research made him an expert in plant root ecology, mycorrhizal fungi, glomalin, and soil carbon formation. He's also worked on biology's enormous influences in hydrological cycles, weather patterns, regional and global cooling, and cloud formation and rain precipitation. So with all of that said, and welcome to all of you, I'm now honoured to hand it over to Wendy and Walter to start the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bonnie.
Okay, would you like me to head off then? So yeah, hi Walter. Hi Bonnie.
Hello,
hi
Wendy.
Ash. Thanks.
Greetings.
Yeah, and lovely to catch up with you again. Yeah, and thanks very much for the intro, Ash and Bonnie. So the field day that we held at our property was called Building Biodiversity for Resilient Farming Systems. And we had a Q&A with Walter, which we're going to go in depth with again today so that we can record it for everyone to listen to. And so the topic of our Q&A was on the link between biodiversity and rainfall or clearing, vegetation and rainfall. So basically, we're focusing on the ground, above and below ground benefits of biodiversity for productive agriculture, including themes of rainfall, carbon, and habitat for beneficial species. So the first question for Walter is, a typical soil constraint in our broad acre agricultural area in relation to water cycle effectiveness is non-wetting soil. What are the links between carbon and hydrology?
Right. Look, thank you very much, Wendy, and greetings, everybody. What I'll do is I'll go through all answers to these questions fairly quickly, because last time we got into a lot of details and we didn't get through all the questions. So I'll go through them fairly quickly, but then we can always come back with more your questions for further explanation, right? Now, basically, as Bonnie sort of said, yeah, we're facing a fundamental challenge in terms of losing a lot of our rainfall, 20% less rainfall and so forth in our systems. And so really the critical thing is, what do we do with all the rain that we get? Even if we're getting less, it's actually what do we do with every 100 drops that we do get? And the issue is very simple. Do we infiltrate it into our soils, store it in our in-soil reservoirs, and then have it available for plant growth, sustainable biodiversity plant growth, or does it run off and evaporate and effectively become lost? And see, at the moment, around Australia, and the data, for example, from the Murray-Darling Basin, is that 86% of the water that we get from the 100 drops of rain is, in a sense, kept on our soils, but perhaps 30 drops out of that 86 are used by transpiration, by green growth, and over 50 drops runs off and is lost effectively out to sea or by evaporation. So we're losing 50 drops out of 100 because that constraint in our soils to infiltrate and retain it. In that 100 drops, some 12 end up in our streams. You know, that's the water in our streams. 2 drops out of 100 end up in our dams. That's the full capacity of our dams, 2 out of 100. And of course, we're reliant on those dams for all our agricultural irrigation water, for our urban water, and for our industrial water. So the point is we've got 25 times more water that we're losing compared to our dam capacity. And the whole secret in terms of soil constraints is rebuilding the Earth's soil carbon sponges and in-soil reservoirs so that 50 drops out of 100 can actually be kept in the soils to drive biodiversity and healthy green biosystems. Now, when we dry soils and when we degrade soils, nature is actually not going to be just standing by. Nature says, look, I have to seal the surface of these soils to stop evaporative losses because that water is precious. And so it does that by growing fungal and algal crusts, non-wetting crusts on that soil. And so the non-wetting soils that you have really a natural defensive reaction from nature to limit evaporation. And of course, when we look at those soils, we say, hey, they're not infiltrating. But if we look at a slightly bigger perspective, you know, across, you know, like a 20-meter square area, there'll be infiltration zones. So what nature is doing, it's shedding water over 95% of its area that it's protecting, but it will letting that water run into these infiltration zones. They're often litter zones or zones under trees or vegetation where the water does infiltrate. So it's actually a very sophisticated water protection and harvesting system. Unfortunately, we see it as non-wetting soils because if we sample the soil, we say 95% of this surface is non-wetting. And of course, we should be very grateful that it is. Now, the other question that basically Wendy raised was the link between carbon and hydrology. And of course, that's then very clear. The sponge, the capacity of our soils to infiltrate and receive water depends on its structure, which depends fundamentally on its organic matter content, which is carbon. And so plants, by putting carbon into the soils through photosynthesis and microbial ecologies that turn it into humates and glomalin, are really fundamental for building the sponge, infiltrating water into the soil, creating the whole hydrology, which then underpins the biodiversity and productivity of that land.
Awesome, Walter, that makes a lot of sense. And following on from that, it would make sense that rainfall trends would be decreasing. But my next question is, what are rainfall trends in relation to the percent cover of native vegetation?
Okay, this is really, again, pretty fundamental. It's in a sense not controversial, it's all there, but it's never been actually accepted as standard practice because we more or less take the role that, yes, vegetation needs rainfall to grow, and of course it does, but basically we've never really looked at vegetation as a factor, a variable that we can manage to influence rainfall. And of course, it does that very directly in nature. So it does that through 3 basic things. Now, obviously, when you've got vegetation, then that vegetation by growing transpires water back from the soils back into the air. And so that transpiration of water is actually fundamental in recharging the atmosphere with water, which then again later on falls as rain. Okay, and so for example, up to 80% of inland rainfalls are dependent on the vegetation, the transpiration of vegetation, in a sense, upwind of it, right? So basically, vegetation is transpiring, putting water in the air, and then that water is again nucleated, or it then condenses again on these nuclei and turns into raindrops, and so then the rain falls. So for example, in the Amazon basin, every gram of water is actually transpired and re-precipitated 7 times as water moves across the basin. So the rainfall in the basin is 7 times greater than the actual total amount of rain coming in from the Atlantic Ocean, because every day it cycles in that transpiration precipitation process. So here we've got this wonderful example where you've got this force multiplier. You've got 7 times the rainfall compared to the quantity of water coming into the basin. So that's very profound. There's another process that actually is, again, very important. If you have vegetation on the land, then basically it protects that soil surface, it keeps it moist, and of course it keeps it much cooler. And if it's much cooler, it basically re-radiates far, far less heat back into the air compared to if it was a bare, hot, dry, exposed surface. And it's that re-radiation of heat from the air that actually creates either high pressure heat domes over bare land or low pressure valleys, moist valleys, where you've got well vegetated landscapes. And of course, rainfall is low pressure air, okay, moist low pressure air, and moist low pressure air cannot flow into high pressure zones over bare, hot, dry land. And so if we have, for example, bare fallows, or we desertify landscapes, by definition, we are aridifying them, not through just the water we lose in the soil, but also we're preventing moist, cooler, low pressure air from flowing into those regions and therefore giving us rainfall. So our vegetation directly governs the inflow of moist air, moist low pressure air, and therefore further rainfall. So deserts reinforce deserts, green vegetated lands reinforce rainfall. Vegetation has another very critical effect. This gets more at the microscopic level. Basically, for water in the air to actually fall out as rainfall, it needs to precipitate. And to do that, it needs to have precipitation nuclei. These are particles on which it can coalesce and therefore fall out under gravity. And of course, in nature, there's 3 key nuclei, key types of nuclei. They're ice crystals, salts, and certain bacteria produced by vegetation. And these are then fundamental for nucleating and precipitating rainfall. Now, you know about ice crystals in high latitudes, high altitudes, and cold fronts. We know about the salts over the ocean, and of course, we've been using salts like silver iodide in cloud seeding, rainfall induction. But what we don't actually recognize, but is critical in nature, are these bacterial microbial precipitation nuclei. And they actually drive over 50% of the rainfall in tropical inland areas, so that vegetation, by producing these precipitation nuclei, is actually generating rainfall. And as I said, over 50% of the rainfall, for example, in the Amazon basin is every day driven by these precipitation, microbial precipitation nuclei, forming raindrops, and every afternoon bringing that transpired water back to the soil surface. Next.
Okay. Yeah, okay. So that explanation brought up a couple of questions for me. I don't know if I'm allowed to ask them.
Well, let's write them down, but let's come back onto them as we go through, because otherwise, yeah, we get stuck into this wonderful world of microbial precipitation, right? Exactly.
And maybe they'll get covered anyway as we go along. So the third question was, what is the role of biodiversity in increasing rainfall and the effectiveness of the water cycle? I'm guessing here I'm asking, what is the physiological process by which this happens?
Yes, okay. Thank you very much, Wendy. And this is, again, very interesting. It's basically going beyond the conventional atmospheric physics, in terms of understanding of rainfall, because we've always had rainfall looked at as a physical phenomena rather than as a biological phenomena. But of course, nature is far, far smarter. She doesn't just stay with physics, she actually uses biology. And one of the key things about biodiversity and rainfall links are exactly these precipitation processes we talked about. As we said, over 50% of the Amazon's rainfall is driven by these microbial precipitation nuclei. And then the issue is, well, what sort of vegetation, what sort of biodiversity produces these and what sort doesn't? And there's a lot there that we don't know in terms of specifics, in terms of, you know, what species, what age and what condition produces the most of the precipitation nuclei. We've never done that. But Louis Pasteur back in the 1870s clearly documented this process. And we have lots of case studies where, in a sense, we've destroyed vegetation and as a consequence lost the rainfall because we've lost these precipitation nuclei. One of the classic case studies is, for example, in Madeira, which is a little island in the Atlantic Ocean off Portugal. It was all mahogany rainforest in 1420 when the Portuguese discovered them. They, of course, logged all this mahogany rainforest, floated the logs down the rivers, cut them up with water-powered sawmills, and then made the mahogany ships to go to Asia with to get the spices. But once they'd harvested this whole rainforest, then the whole rainfall and climate of Madeira changed. It turned from a rainforest to, in a sense, a semi-arid scrubland, a bit like the Canary Islands, cacti and what have you. And so the whole rainfall changed on my Madeira because the lack of this precipitation nuclei production. So again, here we have a biodiversity factor dropping that rainfall. Of course, we've got other case studies where we've gone the other way, where we've actually regenerated landscapes with different biodiversity. And of course, by producing these precipitation nuclei, increased the rainfall. So yes, biodiversity has a profound effect, but we don't have all the specific knowledge yet, which species, at what age, at what density produces what level of precipitation nuclei and therefore rainfall.
Great. Thanks, Walter. That's really, really great. I also, just building on that, I understand that having biodiverse landscapes means that there's more different types of plants with different types of root systems that can access moisture, you know, at different depths, and therefore help to create that water cycle more effectively.
Look, absolutely, Wendy, thank you. And this is absolutely true, isn't it? The more biodiversity you are, first of all, you're using that soil hydrological resource much, much more effectively and efficiently, because as Wendy said, you've got roots taking water from different layers. And the really critical thing here, this is so, so important, particularly in West Australia, this actually drives the longevity of green growth. And that's the key variable, the longevity. Can I keep vegetation green, transpiring, protecting for as long as possible? So it's not the rate of growth, it's not the quantity of growth, it's the actual length of time, because that gives you resilience across that landscape. And of course, the more biodiverse you are, you're really compounding positively that longevity of green growth. So survival, resilience is all about longevity. Can I keep surviving? Can I keep it covered, keep it protected? And biodiversity is a key in that.
Yes, Walter, and of course, the challenge is to have the types of plants that are suited to certain soil types and landscapes so that they can function how they need to. Moving on to the next question. That's awesome, thank you. Did you want to say one quick more thing?
Well, look, absolutely, because the key thing, as we've just said, is to survive. You know, like if you're dead and you've gone. So it's a question of, can I survive? Can I have this longevity? And yeah, if I've got biodiversity of more arid adapted plants that are surviving, I'm keeping that function, that ecological, physiological function. So I keep that landscape alive.
Yeah, and in WA, we've got certain vegetation communities that are so well adapted to the really you know, infertile soils that are so common here.
And look, if
all
I
right,
just
then,
add, if I just add to that,
Yep.
it's exactly where you are in your wheatlands. You see, you've had a very resilient, well-adapted, native, arid-adapted vegetation. You've converted it to wheatland. In its native state, it maintained cover and green 365 days of the year. Now you've got bare fallows for 200 days of the year, and you've fundamentally changed the whole physics of that landscape.
Perfect. And that leads into my next question perfectly. Thank you, Walter. So the next question is, how much area needs to be restored to have an impact on rainfall at a sub-regional scale? So I'm guessing that I'm really talking about native vegetation here.
Yeah, okay. No, this comes back to the previous question, you know, like how much, which species or what biodiversity gives you the best system. These are questions that what area, we don't always have specific data, and it varies across depending where you are. Obviously, it's not going to be just a garden bed, you know, like obviously at a climate level, it's at a bigger scale. But certainly, again, we've got very powerful case studies, including from Western Australia. So, for example, you've got a thing called a rabbit-proof fence. One side is all cleared wheatland, the other side is cleared mallee, you know, forest. And obviously at that scale, yes, the actual native mallee forest basically totally changes the hydrology of that landscape. Clouds form over the barbed wire fence and start then raining to the east of the fence. It now rains 20% more on the eastern side compared to the western side, when in fact the western side by definition has more moist air flowing over it from the Indian Ocean. So in a sense, we cleared up to the rabbit-proof fence because it was moister. Well, that area that we cleared is now 20% drier, lower rainfall compared to the other side. So at that scale, yep, the rabbit-proof fence makes it clear. But we've got other nice experiments. For example, there's a guy called Charles Darwin, and he with Hooker, who was the president of the Royal Society in 1870s, did an experiment on Ascension Island. You know, Ascension Island, again, is a little island in the Atlantic Ocean. The British had put goats on it to feed their naval supply systems. Obviously, the goats had eaten everything, and it was a pretty degraded, bare landscape. So Darwin and Hooker tried an experiment, and they had two mountains, or two, bigger hills. One is Bear Mountain, and the other one they call Green Mountain because they revegetated it. And Green Mountain, next to Bear Mountain, now gets basically, 20% more rainfall than Bear Mountain, its neighbor. And obviously Green Mountain is in the order of, couple 1,000 hectares roughly, right? I mean, it's a thing, but so what it's telling us that revegetation zones at that scale in that situation can be effective. There's another colleague, Willie Smiths. He lives up in Kalimantan in Borneo, north of us. And again, he took basically palm oil, degraded palm oil, cut over rainforest. He's got an orangutan sanctuary. He then reforested that sanctuary. He put habitat for orangutans, about 5,000 hectares. And again, he's getting 15% more rainfall in that regenerated rainforest, 5,000 hectares, than in the neighboring surrounding palm oil plantations. So look, it's no question that that sort of scale, like 1,000, 5,000 hectares is effective. You've got other examples in Western Australia, for example, where down on the South Coast, you have valleys. If they're forested, then you've got humid air flowing into them. And of course, enhancing the rainfall compared to valleys nearby, which have basically been overgrazed or cleared. And then they end up with higher temperatures, higher re-radiation in terms of high pressure heat domes, etc., and having less inflowing, cool, moist air. So it's that sort of scale, right? I mean, about 1,000 hectares, and yes, we can influence the rainfall.
Awesome. So I think I'm up to number 5. Just about got lost because I got so fascinated by your story. much to be said about that. So I think we're up to number 5, which is, can surrogate vegetation cover mimic? Can surrogate vegetation cover mimic the role that native vegetation has in maintaining rainfall?
Right. Okay. Look, this is good, and then again, it comes back into that previous biodiversity discussion we had. You see, so nature doesn't discriminate. So as long as it's physiologically active and healthy, then most of this hydrology and most of this process works. Now, again, we don't know, does species A do better than species B? We know, for example, in Madeira, you take out the mahogany, Saligagensis, and you put in scrub, and there's been that dramatic change, but we don't know, what species is best to put in. So basically, what level of surrogate replacement, we don't have that specific knowledge. We do know in the case of Ascension Island, for example, this is really quite a paradox, because Darwin and Hooker used then a whole lot of logical species to recreate Green Island. It seems to have been effective, obviously, but they've got the problem now that these surrogate species they were planted were exotics in part. So now the question, is this a weed problem? And do we have to chop down these forests that Darwin created because these are weeds on Ascension Island? So it's not just surrogate thing, but does it conflict with political dogma? And do we end up desertifying the landscape because we say these things are all of a sudden a weed? And so, again, making the point that there's no such thing as a weed in nature. It's all about the physiology, and have we got plants that can give us that physiology?
Okay, thanks, Walter. So the next question is, what are the impacts of dust storms on rainfall?
Right. Thank you very much. Again, this is, again, critical, and this just makes the point that, deserts reinforce deserts, right? Because when you get dry, bare soil, then obviously you've got very high pressure zones developing, and of course, very active winds. And those winds, of course, are scouring, evaporating, desiccating, but they're also picking up lots and lots of soil, and so you get wind, dust erosion, right? And so, yes, you end up with very much higher dust levels, over 5 billion tons of soil, topsoil is in a sense taken up as dust globally every year. And this dust is actually very, very fundamental climatically, because the dust, the very fine clay dust particles, they actually form haze microdroplets, right? So you'll end up with these hazy dust nucleated, persistent, not clouds, they're just hazes. And these haze microdroplets, they in a sense absorb energy from the sun, incident solar radiation, while they're in the liquid phase. Then they, of course, evaporate because of that heat and form water vapor. And of course, the water vapor is a dominant greenhouse gas. And so you end up with this dual warming effect. But the hazes are also, these haze microdroplets are also negatively charged. And of course, they therefore repel each other, and they stay then suspended as persistent humid hazes. And of course, because they stay persistent, they don't precipitate out, and then they actually aridify the land below, because you'll see that, and you've got that no doubt in West Australia, where you end up with very hot weather, 40 degrees centigrade, but it's 80% relative humidity because of these pollutant hazes, humid hazes, but they never rain because they can't coalesce to form drops big and heavy enough to fall out as rainfall. Okay, and so they form these humid haze, suspended hazes. Basically, we've got a thing called the Asian brown haze, and there's, in a sense, pollutant hazes because of carbon particulates, smog particulates, and dust particulates going all the way from Cairo to Beijing every summer. And yes, they can basically heat the planet, dry the planet, and basically increase about 20% heat absorption in their microdroplets. So these hazes, because of aridification, can suppress rainfall because it, in a sense, prevents that rainfall for nucleating and coming down as rain. And of course, in the Amazon, it's the complete opposite, because you've got these biological precipitation nuclei that every day bring all that transpired water back down as rain. And of course, the only way you can remove these hazes, again, is through these precipitation nuclei, in a sense, coalescing the millions of haze droplets to form a cloud droplet. That cloud then, of course, has a high albedo effect, cooling the surface, and then with further coalescence of the cloud droplets, forming rain droplets that actually take the hazes out of the air. So dust is actually a key driver of aridification and of course of heating. And of course, the less dust we put up there, because we're maintaining longevity of green growth protective landscapes, the more rainfall we get and the cooler and the more vegetated our landscapes.
Wow. So, yeah, and you were talking about the finite amount of water in the world, and just imagine how much of that's being gobbled up in those dust hazes that isn't available to, in other forms, to be used.
Yeah, look, Wendy, this is something very important, you see. It's, and this is so critical. I mean, the blue planet, Earth, is actually absolutely covered with water and has got abundant water. So there's never a shortage. 71% of the planet is ocean, and obviously up to 50,000 parts per million, 5% of the weight of the air is water vapor. So we've got rivers of water flowing across the whole planet, all the world's deserts continually. So it's not a lack of water. What it is the actual lack of these processes, or our disturbance of these processes that cycle the water. Okay, so the Amazon, it's not about how much rain it gets, the fact that it cycles that water 7 times as that moves across the Amazon. So it's getting 7 times the rainfall that it would do if it was just a cleared savanna woodland, for example, right? So yeah. It's not the quantity, it's just the processes and the efficiency of the cycling. And we have agency over these efficiency, these cycling processes. So really our power and our whole future depends on us taking responsibility and restoring these cyclic processes.
Absolutely, that makes so much sense. Okay, so Walter, what is the link between ground cover and soil moisture?
Okay, well, look, we've again talked about that, you know, so these questions are reinforcing each other, very good. But clearly, look, if we've got ground cover, vegetative green ground cover, 365 days of the year, clearly we've got less evaporation, so we're keeping more moisture in the air. We've got less wind scour, as we talked about with the dust, so again, that's keeping the moisture there. But of course, that moisture will be used in transpiration, but so we mustn't see that as a loss, because if we've also, as we're transpiring, putting these microbial precipitation nuclei in the air, we're going to get that moisture back that afternoon. So if anything, it's enhancing rainfall. So again, this makes the point of cycling, isn't it? It's not a case of, hey, we're losing water. The question is, we're actually managing that water, harboring or cycling that water more efficiently, and in that way enhancing our rainfall, as in the Amazon, right? So basically, ground covers are very important in, yes, protecting our soils. As we've also talked about earlier, they're very critical in stopping those soils heating up. You know very well in Western Australia, if you've got a bare fallow out at Newdigate in the middle of summer, you can't walk on those soils. There's 60 degrees centigrade plus at the surface. Whereas if they were covered with vegetation, then they'll be less than 20 degrees centigrade. And of course, that difference in temperature has a profound effect in how much re-radiation is coming from that soil. It's simple physics, Stefan Boltzmann physics. The amount of re-radiation is governed by the 4th power of the temperature. So that's temperature times temperature times temperature times temperature in degrees Kelvin. And so a bare, hot surface will re-radiate massively more heat than a cool, moist, protected surface. And of course, that re-radiation both is the thing that drives the greenhouse effect. It's the thing that drives these high pressure heat domes over these areas. And of course, in both things drives warming and the prevention of rainfall. So yeah, enormous, profound effects, but again, things that we have leverage over, because by simply keeping 365 days longevity of green ground covers and keeping soils cool, we can actually turn down this re-radiation, turn down the greenhouse effect, and enhance rehydration and enhance cooling.
Walter, I just have to say this, like the paradox of what you're saying is that current thinking is, or advice is, that you should spray out your summer weeds if you get summer rain, to conserve your soil moisture for the crops to be grown in the growing season.
Look, and know it very well. And look, this is again the paradox. And yes, obviously people say, yes, you're losing moisture because these weeds are transpiring. But you've got to look at it as a system. These weeds, especially sort of tall dicots, are actually reducing wind speed, reducing evaporation, reducing dust scour over those landscapes, because obviously it's the wind speed at the soil surface which is what drives evaporation and dust. And so the weeds, by protecting that surface, are often far, far more beneficial because they're preventing that loss. The other thing, we've made the point that up to 50,000 parts per million of the air is water vapor. So we have these rivers of water in the air flowing across these areas all the time. And our weeds, these plants are often every night harvesting water from the air directly in their foliage, up to 1 to 2 millimeters a night. So Phil Lee, my colleagues, and I imagine he's on this phone call, but I haven't sort of seen him obviously. But the point is, Phil's done all the work, you see. And again, you go to Newdigate and there you've got fleabane and you've got nightshade. And if you look at the soil moisture under those weeds, it's 70%. Whereas if you go 2-3 meters on either side in bare soil, the soil moisture is down to 20%. So here we are, we're saying, no, the weeds should be losing water, but in fact, their harvesting of water is keeping islands of moist soil under them compared to the bare soil. So again, we in our conventional thinking are actually disadvantaging ourselves, because by killing all those plants, we're actually desiccating that soil more, but we're also, of course, killing all the microbial life in that soil, which is critical for keeping its soil structure, its sponginess keeping its sponginess well, and allowing it to infiltrate rain when the rain does come. Okay, and so nature solves these problems through pioneer plants. It's just tragic that we call these things weeds.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So the next question, I think you've got a part answered there. What is the soil carbon sponge and how do we build it?
Yeah, okay, and we talked about this at length last time, but okay, let's get back to it. I mean, the sponge is really soil structure. You know, have we got an open, crummy, aggregated soil surface that can infiltrate rainfall? And obviously we can have that by having organic matter in that soil structure to keep all the mineral particles separated in an open aerated matrix. And of course, that organic matter can only come from plants because they're the only things that fix carbon. And so it's all about building the soil carbon sponge, which we do by maximizing plant growth. But then the critical thing is not just maximizing plant growth, but making sure that as much of that biomass produced by plants isn't oxidized simply back to CO2, but is instead converted by microbes, largely fungi, in the soil, and converted into humus and glomalin, which is that stable soil carbon building the sponge. Okay, so it's about maximizing plant growth, but then minimizing its oxidation and maximizing its biosequestration as stable soil carbon. 70% of the carbon fixed by plants is already invested by them down under in the soil as roots and root exudates. So we've already got them plants on our side, but what we've got to do is reduce the oxidative land management practices. And in fact, all of our industrial agricultural practice, whether it's land clearing, burning, cultivation, over-fertilization, biocides, bare fallowing, all of these things are oxidative on steroids. And all of those things are taking carbon out of our soils, ending up with structural collapse, and of course, the aridification, the degradation of those land systems. So the sponge is, in a sense, the opposite of that oxidative industrial land degradation.
Awesome. So what specific farming practices can be implemented to assist with building the soil carbon sponge?
Okay, well, look, we've just talked about those, and this is then again, what specific farming practices? It's a bit like medicine, isn't it? Do no harm. And when we understand what we do, then we say, look, all of these industrial agricultural practices, as we go through them again, they're so important: clearing, burning, cultivation, over-fertilization, biocides, bare fallowing. All of them are, in a sense, oxidative. And the thing in nature, we don't do any of those, right? She doesn't do any of that. She basically says, no, I keep my soil structure there. I keep my land covered. I have continual green cover crops. I basically interplant or intersow seeds into that structure. It's like Fukuoka, one straw revolution. You know, it's basically just simple ecological farming practices. It's permaculture. It's just really rebuilding these natural cycles. And it's really saying, how do we redesign regenerative agricultural systems that actually enhances these natural successions and cycles and symbioses and biodiversities in our agriculture. And so that's, in a sense, wherever we are, it's innovative farmers designing smart systems. It's a column size saying, look, here's pasture cropping, where I could put, you know, grain crops into pastures without having to clear and degrade and oxidize. It's in and Haggerty's, again, looking at integrating grazing and cropping. You see, all these innovative farmers are actually exploring then, here are farming practices, but they're all about minimum soil disturbance, minimum soil oxidation, maximizing carbon biosequestration, integrating animals back into landscapes. And in a sense, regenerative farming, that's what it's about. And it's really tailor-making solutions based on local experience, local knowledge, diagnosing what's limiting, and then applying intelligent, wise solutions in that area to achieve these soil sponge regeneration outcomes.
That's really, you know, I guess, you know, it just so makes so much sense. And it reinforces the need for a lot more research into specific areas. You know, there are some areas that seem to be, well, everywhere's different, isn't it? Like you can't just say there's one recipe.
Yes, but in a sense, yeah, okay, absolutely, Wendy. But in a sense, all the information is there, and I suppose this is where regenerative agriculture is. No, it's about basically just observing, listening, looking, and then saying, look, okay, the grape growers in Margaret River are basically perfecting this to avoid desiccation. They're having, you know, cover crops under their grapes, you know, and so it's really looking at everything they're doing and then understanding that in terms of these processes. And then that's reinforcing wisdom, knowledge, and of course, immediately we can apply those processes and that logic wider than just grape growing. And so in a sense, we've got all the intellectual property, we've got all that observation, and it's really seeing it as it is rather than, hey, we've got to go back to a laboratory and do more research. The same thing, all our discussions about hydrology and vegetation, it's, you know, all the uncut diamonds are at your feet. They're all there wanting to be picked up and polished and sparkle.
Yeah, look, I totally agree. And it's so much more about doing on-ground work rather than research in a laboratory, so that farmers can, you know, be supported to make that transition without, you know, such a scary idea to move to something which is, you know, much more regenerative. Like, everybody does some form of regenerative agriculture, I'm sure, but to actually transition to something that is much more, you know, what would be more sort of broadly classified as regenerative,
Yes.
can be a very scary thing.
Yes.
Because it's not mainstream. It's not established science in broadly.
Yeah, and the power is in what you've got, is in your local groups, you know, your local farmer groups, NRM groups, etc. You see, it's a case of saying, look, we're in this area, here's this problem, and then collectively just discussing, well, why is it occurring? Where is it occurring? What are the processes? Who's had success at avoiding before we actually fight it, right? Always back off. We don't have to fight anything. How do we actually manage this thing to avoid it? And so then picking up that local experience, local knowledge, and then in that group, in a sense, looking at where the solutions. By all means, there's always boffins out there, you know, like that you can bring up and call in and say, look, give me some of the science or give me some of the background. There'll always be knockers and blockers who say, that's not conventional, you can't do it. And all you simply say is, well, all right, I can't do it, but nature is. And so I'm just going with nature, right? And it will demonstrate in the outcomes, and it'll demonstrate you've got that green paddock, or you're getting rain, or the rabbit-proof fence on the east is moister and greener than on the western side. And the evidence is in nature.
Yep. So Ash, look, I know we're out of time. Am I allowed to ask one more question?
Oh yeah, look, from my point of view, yes, no troubles. But I mean, you'll just have to, it's either when the phone runs out of battery or, you know, basically Ashley switches a switch.
That's right. So, what do you think, Ash?
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you have any questions, go for it.
Yeah, okay, sorry. It's just one that's really fundamental. And I think it's so important. Walter, when you were talking about low pressure systems not being able to move into high pressure systems, I was just wondering, I know it's probably very basic science, but I was wondering if is there a simple way of explaining why low pressure, you know, those cool.
Oh, okay. Well, look, it's very simple. Like, I mean, it's like mountains and valleys, right? I mean, think of it that way. Like, I mean, basically, you can't have low pressure air flowing into high pressure air. It just hasn't got the muscle. It goes the other way. High pressure always flows to low pressure. It's like water running downhill, right? You know, water doesn't run uphill because it has to basically low pressure to high, can't do it. It's always high pressure to low, right? And so, but we govern what's high pressure and what's low pressure by the amount of re-radiation coming off it. So we own control of the lever through longevity of green growth, because if we keep that re-radiation down, we can actually avoid that area getting hot and therefore high pressure. It's very critical for Western Australia. For example, 6,000 years ago, we still had an Australian monsoon. We had moist air from the Northwest Indian Ocean flowing across your sandy desert and basically nucleating and precipitation in the McDonald-Troyer Central Ranges. You see, and of course, we lost the Australian monsoon. Why? Because we've now got a high pressure heat dome in summer over those extensive desert areas. And so the monsoon is restricted up into the Kimberleys and Arnhem Land, but it doesn't flow into Central Australia anymore. Okay.
So that's yeah. So that makes a lot of sense. And like, it's easy to be looking at the weather map and you can see these, you know, where the person's talking about this big high pressure system coming in.
Yeah.
It's then a leap to be able to connect the dots between, well, you know, what are we doing that we can change that high? It feels like, oh, that's out of our control.
Absolutely. This is so important, Wendy, because see, we've been in a sense locked into the physics where we basically are fatalistic and say, look, this is a fact of the weather or physics or, the earth, and we're just passive recipients. But we've never asked the question, to what extent does our land management, like clearing, burning, desertification, influence that? And I suppose when you look at now the biology of weather, it gives you license to say, well, look, Ekon, have we actually influenced it? Has our burning and actually aridification of that landscape influenced the Australian monsoon? And if it has, more excitingly, can we restore the Australian monsoon? Lake Eyre was a freshwater lake, 25 metres deep, 6,000 years ago. Palm Valley at Alice Springs still has the rainforest, remnant rainforest vegetation, the palms, etc., from the gallery rainforests that were there. If you look at the Todd, Fink, all the rivers running from those Central Australian mountains, if you look at them, they were colossal rivers. Look at the size and the scale. They were very broad rivers, had enormous water flowing, ending up in Lake Eyre. All that's gone in 6,000 years. So the question is, what caused it? And how much did our management of the vegetation, the landscape, its cooling, its high pressure heat domes influence that? Can we restore it?
Okay, so when did that disappear? Because it's only in the last 200 years that we've really intensively changed our landscape, isn't it? In Australia, it's a fair bit less than that.
Look, no, I think we've got to ask the question. I mean, this is important. This is the question you see when we lost the megafauna, and we basically had all that vegetation, all that sclerophyllous vegetation that used to be biodigested by the megafauna, like koalas and wombats, not very nutritious. They ate vast quantities to get the nutrients they need. But instead of that, it just stood there, and we ended up with much, much hotter fires. And of course, we've got that clearly documented in the charcoal record. And of course, because of the hotter fires, obviously the Indigenous, the First Nations had to develop, control burning, fuel reduction burning patterns to avoid themselves getting barbecued itself. They couldn't survive those fires. And with that, the pollen record right across northern Central Australia says very clearly we switched from a savanna woodland of casuarinas and calitruses and kangaroo grathemidars and those sorts of savanna grasses to basically mulga and spinifex. We moved from a savanna into actually an arid mulga and spinifex fire resilient vegetation. 6,000 years ago, over a couple of period, but basically when we lost the megafauna and that fire ecology dominated. Okay, so how much has our grazing ecology and our fire ecology, going back in paleo history, 6,000 years ago, how much did that influence the monsoon? Can we restore the monsoon by actually, now we haven't got megafauna, but we have got herbivores. Can we actually rebuild ecological grazing across 200 million hectares of Western Australia's, eastern rangelands to actually rebuild those low pressure areas to get that humid, moist air from the Indian Ocean? The Indian Ocean's the world's biggest evaporation basin. We've still got this humid air flowing across Australia continually to New Zealand. Can we harvest some of that as we did previously in the Australian monsoon?
Awesome. I think I've opened a big can of worms.
That's what this webinar is all about. Can of worms,
yeah,
right?
Absolutely.
Because worms are good in the soil as well.
I do have a question, Walter. In all that we've discussed today, what do you see the role of the key stakeholders playing in this? Obviously we come from our landholders and our farmers, but it can't, they do have a key role, but it can't all be up to them.
No. Yep. No, look, absolutely. Now, you are the key stakeholder. Now, that's the first thing, that you say, look, no, we're running this thing. Well, nature's running it. You're just her servant, right? But the point is that, yes, you're the stakeholder. It's your life. It's your livelihood. It's your future. You're young. It's your future that's at stake, right? So secondly, and then the answer is no, it's we collectively as groups, as your, local groups, your NRM groups, and saying, look, we're asking these questions and we're actually collecting this grassroots knowledge, observation, listening, problem solving, and saying, First Nations, where's the wisdom, where's the experience, right? And you're just bringing that all together. And the people that you're assuming are your stakeholders are really your politicians, but they actually, like low pressure systems or high pressure, they just flow to the path of least resistance, wherever the agenda, the community is in a sense interested, right? And they'll sort of want to come and kiss the babies and sort of cut the ribbons. And so, no, it's you you're the stakeholder, you're driving it, you're young, it's your future. So you take hold of it, and then you'll find that you're leading that debate and you're leading the questions. And with those questions, you lead the change. Empower yourself, right? Because, well, I mean, again, in the context of nature here as natural processes, you're not going to change those, but the more you can understand, learn, and regenerate them, you're empowering yourself. You've got nature on your side, and that's always the winning formula.
That's it. Thank you, Walter. Wendy or Walter, did either of you have any closing statements or remarks?
Look, from my point, there may be lots of questions arising invariably. And so, look, let's just keep them going, and then let's keep in touch, and happy to fill in any details.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Walter. I just think that's been awesome, and it's just been so illuminating about how much power as a farmer we can have. And as like the grower groups have in representing the farmers and helping to bring them together. So I think that's been hugely helpful.
Yeah. And just again, in concluding, yes, of course, Western Australia, your farmers, you're in the front line, but also in a sense, you're the agency for the future. So you're not just in the front line being impacted, but in a sense, it's you that are in control.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I think that's a key message is it's not just about being, a victim of climate change. We can actually have an impact on that. Very
much so. Okay, well, look, thank you very much. I'm just about to lose a battery, so all the best. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Walter.
Thanks, Walter.
Thanks, Walter.